They called my name like it was a punchline. Sharp, formal, the weight of rank carrying through the air, bouncing off the walls of the Naval Banquet Hall. Lieutenant Commander Alexandra Rhodes. The applause that followed was steady, respectful. I stepped forward, my shoes clicking against the polished floor, the silver bars on my chest catching the light. My hands were steady, my posture perfect. And yet, the only thing I searched for as I took that long walk toward the Admiral's platform was his eyes. Admiral Jonathan Rhodes. My father. He didn't clap. He didn't nod. He didn't even look at me. He turned his head slightly, to cough, to adjust his collar, maybe just to pretend the moment wasn't happening. And for the first time since I was 8 years old and asked if I could wear his dress cap to a school costume day, I realized something. My father never intended to see me as a soldier, only as a mistake. I stood still as they placed the Distinguished Tactical Service Medal around my neck. The clasp was warm from the officer's hand. The ribbon brushed against the spot where my father once pinned a junior sailing badge on me in our backyard. He was smiling then. I was 11. I remember thinking he looked proud. I was wrong. That wasn't pride. That was relief. I was still small, still manageable, still someone he could shape. The moment I started shaping myself, the pride turned cold. When the ceremony ended, I stepped off the stage and tried to meet him halfway. He was speaking to Rear Admiral Levinson. I waited. He saw me. I know he did. Because his shoulders straightened, and his mouth set in that flat, sharp line I knew too well. I saluted. Sir, I said. Not Dad, not even Jonathan. Just, sir? He didn't return the salute. He looked past me, to the rows of officers still shaking hands, and muttered, just loud enough for me to hear. The Navy used to mean something. That was it. 6 words that hollowed me out more than a bullet ever could. 6 words that told me everything I had endured: SEER training, submarine rotation, field medical trauma work, 3 combat tours, meant less than his disappointment. And worse, less than his image. Later that night, I found myself in the parking lot sitting on the hood of my car, still in uniform, holding the medal in my hand like it weighed 100 pounds. I thought about driving to the base gate, turning in my ID, walking away from it all. Not because I was ashamed, but because I was tired of being told I should be. But I didn't. I stayed. Because I remembered the faces of the corpsmen in my last unit, the way they looked at me after a successful extraction. Because I remembered a young recruit crying on the second day of survival training, and how I sat with her for an hour until she got up and finished the course. Because I remembered that this uniform never belonged to him, not really, and it damn sure didn't need his approval to mean something. Still, I couldn't sleep that night. I lay in bed at the base lodging facility staring at the ceiling, going over every conversation we ever had that ended in silence. The day I got my first commendation, he said I was lucky. The day I got promoted to lieutenant, he said it was political. The day I told him I'd been selected for tactical command school, he asked if the standards had changed. He never said congratulations, not once, not in 20 years of service. The next morning I called him. Just once. He didn't answer. Later, he sent a text. Stop using my name to make yourself something you're not. I stared at the screen until it blurred. Then I deleted the message and blocked the number. I didn't respond. There was nothing left to say. 3 months passed. I wore the medal only once, at a joint base luncheon where no one really asked what it was for. I tucked it away in the back of my drawer after that. Next to the faded Polaroid of me in his old uniform shirt, sleeves too long, grinning like I had the world in my hands. I thought about throwing that photo away, but I didn't. Not yet. Because part of me still hoped that one day he'd see me for who I really was. Not his shadow. Not his echo. But a soldier who didn't need to borrow pride from any man. The day that hope died was the day I received a letter from the Chief of Naval Operations himself. It was a handwritten note of commendation. For valor. For leadership. For a decision made under fire that saved 17 lives in a forward operating zone no civilian even knew existed. I placed it in an envelope and mailed it to him. No note. No message. Just the citation. A week later, I received a package on my doorstep. Inside, the citation torn into 4 pieces, and a single yellow sticky note. Paper burns. Names don't. That's when I understood. He didn't just disapprove of me, he hated that I existed. He hated that I wore the same uniform he did and that I had the gall to be recognized for it. I sat in my kitchen for a long time after that. The envelope pieces spread across the table. The sticky note folded in half. I lit a match and burned it all in the sink. Not out of rage, out of something cleaner. Resolve. I stopped trying to be his soldier that day, but I didn't stop being one, and I had no idea that the very men he idolized, revered, and held above all others would one day stand up for me, in a way he never could. That part hadn't happened yet, but it would, and when it did, I wouldn't be looking for his eyes anymore. I'd be looking past him. He never liked questions, not even the small ones. Especially not from me. When I was 7, I asked what his medals meant, what they stood for, why some were gold-rimmed, others dull and flat. He didn't answer, just glanced over the rim of his whiskey glass and said, "They're earned. That's all you need to know." I stood in silence, trying to memorize the shine, trying to absorb the meaning by osmosis, because I wanted to be like him then. No, I wanted to be seen by him. That was the difference. I didn't dream of battlefields or ocean deployments. I dreamed of one nod, one smile that didn't feel like it had been earned through silence. I was 8 when I first saw my father in full dress whites. I remember the way the sun struck his shoulder boards and made the gold braid on his cap glow like something celestial. He looked untouchable, otherworldly. The young men around him stood stiff, proud, careful not to breathe in the wrong direction. But I just stood by the car door, watching him walk across the tarmac, my hands wrapped tight around the little flag I'd brought from home. When he finally reached us, I held it up to him. He didn't take it, just placed a hand on my shoulder and said, "Stand straight." That was his greeting. That was his love, discipline, distance, and eyes that always looked just over my head. It didn't stop me from trying. At 10, I begged to join the junior sailing club at the naval base. He told me no, said I'd cry the first time my hands blistered. I signed up anyway, with Mom's forged signature, and spent that summer bleeding into ropes and salt water until I could tie a bowline knot blindfolded. When I showed him the certificate at the end of the program, he didn't look at it. Just said, "If the standard's that low now, maybe they'll let dogs enlist next." I laughed. I always laughed. Pretended he was joking, that he was proud in his own way. That maybe if I kept pushing, kept rising, I'd find the version of me he was waiting to see. Maybe I'd become her. Maybe I'd finally become someone he didn't have to look past. The first time I told him I wanted to enlist, he was sitting at the kitchen table reading the paper. He didn't flinch. Didn't fold the page down. Just said, "The Navy doesn't need pity projects or politics." I stood there, hands shaking, application folder pressed to my chest like a shield, and I said, "It's not politics. It's my life." He didn't argue. Just stood up, poured himself another drink, and said, "Then don't use my name. You won't get far on merit, but at least you'll know it wasn't mine that failed you." That night, I cried into my pillow so softly the sheets absorbed every sound. I didn't want my mother to hear. She always tried to smooth things over, tried to tell me he was harder on me because he saw potential. But I wasn't a fool. He didn't see potential. He saw insult, an echo where he wanted silence. When I entered the Naval Academy, I went under my mother's maiden name for the first year. Rhodes was too loud, too heavy. People heard it and asked questions. "Are you related to Admiral Rhodes? Did he help you get in?" I didn't want that. I wanted them to see me, not his shadow. But even when I reverted back to my full name in second year, it didn't change how I carried myself. I was always the first to report, the last to leave. I studied while others slept. I ran until my knees burned. I learned to carry men twice my weight out of mock fire zones. I memorized every inch of a submarine's ventilation system, not because I needed to, but because I couldn't afford to be anything less than unbreakable. At graduation, cadets walked up to their families. Mothers wept. Fathers shook hands with pride. My father didn't attend. He said he had an obligation at the Pentagon that week. I found out later it was a charity golf tournament. My mother sent flowers in his name. I smiled when I opened the card, even though I knew it wasn't his handwriting. "Proud of you," it read. 3 words that burned hotter than any flame I'd faced in training. The years that followed didn't change much. As I moved up in rank, my relationship with him stayed fixed, like rust welded into place. He never came to my promotions, never replied to my deployment letters, never sent a single message when I returned from operations. But he spoke about me to others. I knew this because people would say, "Your dad mentioned you. He said you're tough, said you don't take shortcuts." I always smiled, said thank you, and tried not to ask when, where, why he could say those things to strangers, but never to my face. The one time we crossed paths in an official setting, I was leading a debrief at a joint force exercise. He walked in mid-session, flanked by junior officers like a king entering court. He looked at the slides, at the men around the table, then at me. No greeting. No acknowledgement. At the end, he said, "You run a clean room. Keep it that way." Then he left. It was the only compliment he ever gave me directly, and it sounded more like a command than a praise. There were others who believed in me. Captain Hughes, Commander Reyes, even Chief Beckett, the grizzled combat diver who once called me ma'am with a smirk and ended up fighting beside me in a live fire evac. They didn't care whose daughter I was. They cared that I kept my word, held my ground, and never asked for favors. That's what carried me through the dark nights overseas, the way my team trusted me to come back, even when the mission parameters said otherwise. But somehow, no matter how far I went, the silence from him followed. It was in every base transfer where he refused to send a note. In every award where I scanned the crowd hoping, foolishly, that maybe this time he'd show. He never did. When my mother died, he didn't call me until 2 days after the funeral. He said he'd been dealing with logistics. What logistics, I never asked. When I said I'd taken a week of leave to stay in her house and sort through her things, he said, "Don't make it a spectacle." As if grief was a performance. As if remembering her out loud would be a betrayal of some unspoken order. That was the moment something small in me cracked. It didn't break, not yet. But it bent into a shape I didn't recognize. Something colder. Something less willing to chase shadows. I began to withdraw. Not from duty, but from him. I stopped sending updates. I stopped reaching out. I accepted that some fathers are only loyal to the version of family that fits their reflection. And I had long outgrown that mirror, but fate has a way of circling back. And the more I excelled, the harder it became for him to ignore me. My name began to appear in reports, in after-action briefs, even in internal memos that crossed his desk. I know this because someone once slipped me a copy of one. The heading read, "Recommendation for Strategic Command Placement, Latin CMDR Rhodes." His initials were in the margin. No comment. No approval. No objection. Just 2 letters, NR, not recommended. No explanation, so I pushed harder. I trained longer. I took the most dangerous assignments, things no one else volunteered for. Urban clearance, waterborne hostage extractions, underwater demolition recon, each one successful, each one scarring. I started to collect stories on my body, a burn on my right calf, a fracture in my collarbone that still sings in cold weather, a scar behind my ear where shrapnel kissed the bone. Every mark became a kind of ledger. Not to prove myself to him, but to prove that I existed. That I could write my name in blood, sweat, and silence, and still stand straight at the end of it all. And yet, no matter how far I rose, I was still not a soldier in his eyes. Just a daughter in uniform. A liability. A woman in a man's theater. He never said it out loud, but every look, every silence, every omission carved it deeper. I wasn't what he wanted. I wasn't who he thought deserved the rank. And he would rather amputate me from his legacy than admit he was wrong. I carried that truth like a stone in my chest. Not heavy enough to stop me. Just enough to keep the air from ever feeling clean. Still, I moved forward. Because even if he refused to see me as a soldier, the day was coming when 750 of the fiercest warriors in the world would, and they would not only see me, they would rise for me. And that moment would echo louder than every silence he ever gave me. It was the kind of event where the flags are ironed, not just folded, where even the coffee cups are aligned by someone who understands the importance of straight lines and silent reverence. A military retirement gala, held in the heart of Norfolk, beneath a chandelier older than most of the officers in the room. The kind of place where whispers are protocol, and laughter is rationed more carefully than ammunition. The Navy's elite were there that night. Commanders, admirals, SEAL legends with stories behind their scars. It was the culmination of 38 years of service for Rear Admiral Charles Whitmore, a man my father had served with during the Persian Gulf era, and a close family friend, or at least he had been, before I outgrew being little Alex, the girl in oversized dress blues at Christmas dinners, asking to sit near the grown-ups to listen to war stories I wasn't supposed to hear. I had only been back from deployment for 2 weeks. I didn't even want to attend, but I was listed on the program as one of the honorary recipients for the new Cross Branch, Tactical Medal of Distinction, awarded jointly by the Navy and Marine Corps for a covert joint operation I wasn't allowed to publicly speak about. It was a formality. Shake hands. Accept the medal. Disappear before dessert. That was the plan. I wore my dress whites with the precise minimalism I had perfected over the years. No extra ribbons, no unnecessary flair. The SEALs called it quiet armor. It meant you didn't need decoration to remind people of what you'd done. My hair was pinned back with the same silver clasp I wore on my first mission. No one noticed. That was fine. I wasn't there to be seen. I was there to pass through. My name came up third on the list. They read my citation aloud with a mechanical tone, careful not to name the operation, just the results. For sustained excellence in joint force leadership under hostile conditions, and for command-level decision-making resulting in the preservation of Allied personnel in high-threat regions. The room clapped, polite, distant, standard. Then I stepped forward, took the medal, saluted, and returned to my seat. And that should have been the end of it. But of course, it wasn't, because then came the speech. My father stood behind the podium like a man returning to his throne. The room settled immediately. He had that kind of presence, even now, even when time had pressed deep lines around his mouth and silver had replaced the iron in his hair. He didn't clear his throat. He never needed to. The room would wait for him to begin breathing again. He started with history, his favorite weapon. Spoke about legacy, about sacrifice, about how in his day, soldiers didn't ask what the country could do for them, but what they could bleed for without asking for thanks. I listened from my seat in the back, the metal still warm against my uniform. My fingers curled tightly around the edge of the citation folder. I told myself to let it pass. Let the speech be his. Let the oxygen go where it needed to. But then he pivoted. I look around this room, he said, eyes scanning like sonar, and I see men who understand what service really means. I see warriors who stood in the fire, not for applause, not for promotion, but for the soul of this nation. Men who didn't need hashtags to prove their worth. Men who didn't trade combat for commentary. Who didn't bend the Navy into a mirror for their own reflection. He didn't name me, but every syllable felt like a bullet with my name etched on the casing. A few heads turned toward me. I kept my eyes forward. Jaw-locked, he went on. In today's Navy, he continued, we hand out medals like participation trophies. We bend our standards in the name of inclusivity. We mistake ambition for leadership and emotion for valor. And worst of all, we let politics into our chain of command. That's not the Navy I served. That's not the Navy I built. Silence followed, the kind that eats oxygen. And then, The final blow. He turned fully toward the audience, his voice tightening into something colder than steel. And I speak as a father when I say, legacy does not mean inheritance. Just because someone carries your name doesn't mean they carry your honor. There are those who wear the uniform but disgrace the cloth. And we must not be afraid to say so. Not even when it's our own blood. Someone coughed. Someone else set their glass down too hard. I sat there, not moving, not blinking. The metal on my chest felt radioactive. I didn't need confirmation. I didn't need a follow-up. That was it. He had waited until I was in uniform, in a room full of command officers, in front of men I had bled beside, and he had unloaded it all there. Not out of anger, not even out of cruelty, but out of calculation. Because he knew I wouldn't respond. Because he knew I wouldn't cause a scene. Because he knew that if he waited until my silence became part of the background, it would only solidify the narrative he was building, that I was weak, that I was undeserving, that I was only ever a disruption to the shape of his myth. I stayed seated as the room clapped, fewer hands this time. A few people avoided my eyes as I left during the toast. I didn't go to the reception. Didn't take the complimentary coin. Didn't sign the guest book. I walked out into the cold night air and didn't exhale until I reached my car. My hand shook on the wheel, not from rage, but from the effort it took not to let that rage become me. I stared out at the fog curling off the asphalt and remembered the little girl holding a flag who thought her father was a god. That girl was gone, and in her place was someone harder, sharper, quieter. I didn't cry. I didn't call anyone. I just sat there for nearly an hour, letting the silence rearrange my spine into something even straighter than before. The next morning, the gala photos were everywhere. The Navy Times ran a small feature. Admiral Rhodes speaks on the future of military discipline. My name was listed beneath a cropped photo. No quote, no comment. Just, recipient of CTMD Medal of Distinction. And below that, daughter of Admiral Rhodes. No rank. No first name, just an accessory. I deleted the article, burned the printout, and went back to the base with a stillness inside me that didn't crack, even when Beckett came by and said, "Saw what he said. If you ever want to slug something, I got a spare punching bag." I thanked him, but I didn't need it. Because I had already made the decision, I wouldn't outrun him. I would outlive him, in service, in silence, and in the eyes of the very men he idolized. I would make sure that the next time someone heard my name, they wouldn't ask, "Are you related to Admiral Rhodes?" They would ask him, "Are you related to her?" And that moment was already on its way, because in less than 6 weeks, I would be embedded in an operation that would stretch every nerve in my body to the edge of snapping. An op that wouldn't just test my command, it would etch it into history. He had made a speech about honor, but I was about to teach 750 Navy SEALs what honor really looked like. And when they stood for me, I wouldn't need to say a word, because sometimes silence is the loudest rank of all. The silence didn't come all at once. It crept in like fog after a battle, slow, quiet, touching everything without asking for permission. I didn't wake up one morning and declare I was done trying. That would have been too dramatic, too theatrical, too unlike me. No, it happened the way erosion happens to a stone. Gradually, invisibly. Then suddenly you look down and realize the shape is gone. The weeks after the gala blurred into a rhythm that should have felt familiar. Briefings, drills, equipment checks, deployment prep. But nothing felt the same. Not because my duties had changed, but because something fundamental had collapsed inside me. I had spent nearly 2 decades operating under an invisible command, the silent belief that one day, if I pushed hard enough, bled long enough, rose high enough, he would salute me back. He wouldn't have to say it. He wouldn't need to hug me or even shake my hand. Just a nod. Just the acknowledgement that I had earned a place in the world he considered sacred. But now I knew better. I had stood in the same room as him, wearing the same uniform, bearing a medal forged from a mission that most would not survive. and still, in his eyes, I was an infection. A crack in the glass he tried to keep polished for the world. After the gala, the message was clear. I would never be one of them, at least not to him. My name would never carry the same weight as his, no matter how much I lifted with it. I was a woman in a legacy he had already written, and I didn't fit the story. That realization didn't break me. It unhooked something deeper. It made me lighter, because for the first time, I stopped needing the salute I had built my life around. I stopped adjusting my tone to sound like his. I stopped studying the rules he had written in his silence. And once I stopped trying to be his soldier, I became mine. The version I had buried beneath layers of performance and precision. She was still there, fierce, focused, fully aware of how capable she had always been without needing the permission of a man who couldn't see past his own reflection. I leaned into my work with a different energy after that. Not desperate, not bitter, just clean, focused. My orders were sharp. My decisions were quieter. I started showing up in ways that didn't require announcements. I made things run before anyone knew they were broken. And people noticed, not in speeches, not in medals, but in the way they looked at me when the map table went red. In the way my men moved without hesitation when I gave the signal. I had been assigned to a pre-deployment command rotation at Camp Argo, a joint ops facility tucked between nothing and nowhere in Nevada, designed to test cross-branch operational cohesion under stress. I had been here before, years earlier as a trainee, later as a guest instructor, but this time, I was taking over the 2nd Platoon of Echo Command, a hybrid unit consisting of Marine Recon, Navy SEALs, and a pair of Air Force pararescue specialists who'd seen more broken bodies than most trauma surgeons. The mission was part exercise, part preparation for something they wouldn't name. That's how I knew it was real. They didn't brief us with details, just fragments. Movement in the Black Echo Zone. Silence from allies we weren't allowed to name. Coordinates that had been hot 2 years ago and had suddenly gone dark again. The 2nd Platoon was used to turnover. No CO had lasted more than 4 months. They were good, lethal, smart, fluent in violence and silence, but they didn't trust easily. I didn't blame them. Most leaders came in trying to impress. I didn't. I came in and listened. I watched how they moved, noticed who double-checked the ropes without being told, who kept eyes on the exits even during lunch, who sat with their backs to walls out of habit, not fear. The second night, I didn't give a speech. I simply told them we'd run night drills without warning. That was it. At 0300, I activated the blackout protocol. No lights, no sound. Just movement in the dark. They adapted quickly. Not perfectly, but better than I expected. When they finished, I handed out maps with their own paths marked in red, mistakes only someone who had truly watched would have caught. I didn't say what they meant. I didn't have to. From that moment, I stopped being a visitor. I wasn't theirs yet, but I was no longer a stranger. A week later, word came down that we'd be folded into Operation Dustwire, the unofficial name for what would eventually become publicized, years later, as a multinational joint rescue and extraction. The type of operation where satellite footage gets classified before it's even downloaded. We were briefed in layers. Never the full picture. That's how these things worked. I didn't ask questions. I trained them for every variable. Urban extraction, underwater insertion, mountain evacs, trauma stabilization with no comms, psychological containment in case we recovered friendlies in unstable conditions. We drilled until sweat replaced speech. I ran them to the edge and they came back asking for more. Not because they liked it, but because they knew I wasn't asking for anything I hadn't done myself. I didn't scream. I didn't pace. I didn't preach. I corrected quietly, sharpened them, removed ego like shrapnel. One night, after an especially brutal conditioning circuit, one of the SEALs, Ramirez, approached me. He wasn't the loud type, which meant what he was about to say mattered. "You don't talk like the others," he said. "You move like you've already bled for it." I didn't respond, just nodded. That was enough. It was the first time in years I felt something that resembled belonging, not through bloodline, Not through name, but through sweat and silence. Back in my quarters, I stared at the medal from the gala, still tucked inside the drawer where I'd left it after that night. I didn't throw it away. I didn't frame it. I just opened the box, looked at it under the dim light, and whispered something I hadn't said out loud until then. He doesn't matter. It wasn't a declaration. It wasn't even anger. It was a truth I had been circling for years and had finally touched with bare hands. My father's approval wasn't currency anymore. His rank wasn't shelter. His legacy wasn't a map. He was a man. Just a man. And I had given him too much power over a life he hadn't earned the right to shape. That was the night I took off the necklace I'd worn since Annapolis, his graduation pin, repurposed into a charm by my mother years ago, and dropped it into the same box as the medal. I closed the lid, and with it, I closed the last chapter of the soldier I had trained myself to be for him. From now on, I would command not with the weight of his name shadowing mine, but with the strength of what I had built on my own spine. From now on, I would serve not as a Rhodes trying to reclaim honor, but as a woman who had never lost it to begin with. The day I stopped trying to be his soldier wasn't marked on a calendar. There were no witnesses, no flags raised, no speeches. Just a quiet shift in the air, like something unseen leaving the room. But I felt it. And for the first time in my military life, I felt whole, because I was no longer moving toward him. I was moving toward something greater, something I couldn't name yet, but it was coming. And when it arrived, it would silence every voice that ever told me I wasn't enough, including his. You learn quickly that there are places in the military where words don't carry weight, where you can arrive with ribbons and bars and commendations sewn into your chest, and none of it means anything. Where names are just background noise unless they're earned again in sweat, blood, or silence. Bud S was one of those places. The SEALs don't care who you are when you show up. They care who you become when everything is stripped away. I wasn't supposed to be there, not officially. I wasn't on the track to earn a trident. That wasn't my path. But after Operation Gray Signal, my command requested I embed for 2 months as an observer in training to prepare for integrated rescue assignments. I was told I wouldn't be expected to participate in every evolution, only enough to understand the language, the pace, the pain. But I did them all anyway, because I knew the only thing worse than being invisible in a place like that was being visible without earning it. The first day was nothing like I imagined. There were no slow introductions, no speeches about brotherhood, no orientation packages. Just the sound of ocean wind slicing across the sand and a voice barking numbers before the sun had even broken over the horizon. I was older than most of them by 5 years, maybe more. I had seen real combat, lost people whose names I still whispered when I couldn't sleep. But none of that mattered here. Not when we were crawling through cold mud, face down, with gravel grinding into our skin like memory. The instructors didn't look at me twice. They didn't give me leeway. They didn't challenge me harder. They acted like I didn't exist. And that was the hardest part. I could have asked for a different approach. I could have reminded them that I wasn't a candidate, that I outranked several of the men running beside me. But what would that have proved? Nothing. Respect here wasn't something you demanded. It was something you buried into the soles of your boots and hoped they noticed when your footprints didn't stagger. So I kept going. When the others ran, I ran. When they were ordered into the surf, I went in first. When they carried the logs across the beach, I took the heaviest end without asking. Not to prove I was strong, just to prove I was present. By the third day, I couldn't feel my shoulders. My hands were raw. My legs ached in a way that made standing feel like punishment. I hadn't spoken more than 6 words to anyone. No one asked why I was there. No one offered me help. But they watched. SEALs don't talk when they're unsure. They wait, they measure. They observe like wolves deciding if the figure at the edge of the pack is worth biting or welcoming. I knew I was being tested without being told. Not just physically, but in the way I didn't flinch when the instructors insulted me. In the way I didn't glance sideways when they made remarks about political experiments in uniforms. In the way I didn't respond when they referred to the Navy's recent changes as lowering the drawbridge to let the weak in. I didn't blink. I didn't smirk. I didn't correct them. I just kept moving. Hell Week wasn't part of my schedule, but I was there during a simulation run designed to push endurance and coordination under mental fog. Sleep deprivation, cold exposure, rapid tactical shifts. I wasn't required to participate. But I showed up anyway, just before midnight, gear ready, no command, no permission slip. Just a nod from the lead instructor and a barely perceptible tilt of his head that told me, "Fine, then show us." I did. I kept pace through the night march, hauled weight through tide channels, climbed ropes with blistered palms. I bled from my knuckles and didn't tell anyone. That was the code. If you wanted to be accepted, you didn't ask for bandages. You earned silence by embracing it. Around the fourth day, something shifted. It wasn't overt. No one said anything. But during chow, one of the guys, Reynolds, a second phase candidate from Kansas, slid his tray closer to mine without comment. Another Sing nodded at me before we went out for the next set. And then, in the middle of a night nav exercise, I fell. Not hard. Just enough to scrape a knee and drop my compass in the mud. Before I could react, a hand was already reaching down. I looked up and saw Ramirez, one of the most respected among the trainees, barely breathing hard. He didn't say anything, just extended his hand, pulled me up, and kept moving. That was it. No discussion. No judgment. Just recognition. I had crossed some invisible threshold. Not fully in, but no longer out. The days blurred after that. One night, I sat alone by the seawall after final lights, boots still damp, thighs aching from the last run. I stared out at the black water and tried to remember the last time I had felt like part of something without needing to lead it. I realized it had been years, maybe longer. In this space, stripped of everything except muscle and resolve, I felt something closer to belonging than I had in a long time. Not because they accepted me, but because they didn't have to. I had stopped needing acceptance. And that, paradoxically, is what earned it. I never told them about my father. Not once. Not even when one of the instructors, between drills, mentioned knowing Admiral Rhodes from his time in the Med. I just nodded. Let him speak. Didn't mention the bloodline. Didn't connect the dots. I wasn't there as his extension. I was there as the soldier who had bled beside them in silence, who had never once used a name as armor. At the end of the rotation, as I packed my things in the dim yellow of the dorm barracks, Ramirez passed me a coin. Not official, not Navy issued. Just a worn brass token with a trident on one side and the word earned stamped across the other. He didn't explain it. Didn't say goodbye. Just set it on my bunk and left. That was the moment I realized I didn't need a salute. I didn't need a citation. I didn't need my father's words to justify what I had become. Because in that small, unspoken gesture, I had been seen, not as a woman, not as someone trying to prove a point, but as a soldier. One of them, the bleeding had been real, but it had not been in vain, and when the mission came weeks later, when the coordinates dropped and the assignment pulled me back, into the field with those same men, I carried that coin with me. Not for luck, but as proof that even in a world built to measure strength in silence, I had spoken the only way they understood, and they had answered, not with words, but with trust. The name wasn't official. It never made it into press briefings or military records that civilians would ever see. It floated around in whispers, carried in after-action reports with entire pages blacked out, and codified references no one could trace back to geography. They called it Black Echo, not because of what we were sent to do, but because of what we were sent into, a place that swallowed sound and light and men and never returned them the same. We weren't supposed to know that 3 prior recon attempts had gone dark. We weren't briefed on the bodies that were never recovered, or the distress call that came through once and then never again. All we were told was that a Navy Science Intel unit embedded in hostile-controlled territory had lost contact for 72 hours after an encrypted burst transmission tagged Priority Human Asset. The Location was coded deep in an area that, officially, no longer existed on any map. Our orders were sealed. Our departure classified. Our return date left blank. The team was assembled in silence. We weren't called. We were selected. Quiet knock on the door. No questions. A sheet of coordinates? A bag already packed. I recognized 3 of the men instantly. Ramirez, Singh, Beckett. There were 4 others I'd never worked with but knew by reputation. Operators you didn't assign unless you needed a miracle or were prepared to bury the evidence. They didn't ask who was in command. They saw me step forward with the first case file and they fell in without hesitation. That was the difference. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't assert rank. I opened the case, pointed at the intel, and they leaned in, listening like it mattered. It did. Everything in the next 72 hours would matter in ways we couldn't yet predict. The extraction site was buried at the edge of a former industrial zone converted into a deep terrain experimental base. Cold War-era leftovers turned into something unrecognizable. Satellite feeds were blurred. Terrain was uneven, layered with tunnels and structures half submerged in fog and ruin. There were no roads in, no signals out. It was a dead zone. We inserted low, fast, and dark. Blackhawks with rotors silenced as best as engineering would allow. Altitude pushed to limits. Everything inside our packs designed to function in zero comms, zero light. We landed 2 clicks out and moved in on foot. No chatter. No eye contact. The type of movement you only learn after years of operations where a single breath can mean the difference between a mission and a memorial. The compound emerged like a wound in the terrain. Concrete slabs cracking under their own weight. Antenna arrays twisted like bones in the air. Doors were welded, locks destroyed from the inside. We breached on time, no alarms, no heat signatures, no opposition. Just silence so deep it pressed into the skin. Inside, the corridors felt wrong, too narrow, too quiet, as if sound itself had abandoned the place out of respect or fear. We split into teams, cleared the lower levels, and found signs of struggle without signs of life. Overturned desks, equipment fried, notes hastily scribbled in grease pencil across walls. Phrases like "don't wake it" and "second phase not approved" and "she's still down there." I didn't let myself read into it. I kept moving. We found the first body near the comms lab. No wounds, no signs of trauma. Just a man curled into himself, face frozen mid-scream, as if whatever he'd seen had ended him from the inside. Beckett ran a bioscan, flatline. No signs of gas, no infections. Just silence. We moved lower. The air grew colder, despite no environmental systems functioning. We found 3 more bodies, same condition. One woman had her fingers fused around a recorder, but the device had been magnetized to death. Whatever was here, it didn't want to be recorded. I could feel the unease growing in the team. These were not rookies. These were men who had pulled blood from the mouths of comrades and kept fighting. But this was something else. No gunfire, no signs of enemy breach. Just people silenced mid-thought, frozen in fear. In the 3rd sublevel, we found her. She was alive, curled inside a containment chamber lit only by the flicker of backup batteries. Her pulse weak but present. Dr. Noel Carr, CivMil Intel analyst, biophysics specialization, previously embedded in 3 black-budget research projects we were never supposed to know about. Her eyes flicked open the moment she heard our steps. No confusion, no surprise, just a single whisper. "Don't let it follow." We didn't know what she meant. We didn't ask. We lifted her gently, moved back up, retracing our path while Singh covered rear, eyes scanning every corridor with the precision of a man who knew death's footsteps by sound alone. We made it to the exit before the first malfunction. The doors wouldn't open. No system lock. No override. No mechanical jam. Just resistance, as if the steel had decided to remember something it wasn't supposed to. That's when the lights died, not all at once. Flickering first, then black. We switched to NV, but the signal fractured. Interference in the spectrum we couldn't identify. Ramirez tried a hard restart. Nothing. Beckett cursed under his breath. Then we heard it. Not footsteps. Not voices. Something deeper. A vibration in the structure. A pressure shift in the air. Like gravity hiccuping, Dr. Carr began to shake. Not from cold, from recognition. It woke up, she said. I tried to keep it dormant, but we went too far. I told them to stop after the second activation. We demanded answers, but she just kept repeating the same line. It's not human memory. It's not thought. It's echo. We prepared for breach. Singh rigged a secondary detonation to force the exit. We planted, braced, blew. The explosion rocked the corridor and the door remained. Not even dented. The floor cracked instead. And that's when we saw it. Beneath us, a second level not in any of the schematics. Built under the base of the base. Lit faintly with red emergency strobes, flickering through broken vents. And in the center something pulsed. Not alive, but aware. It looked like a structure. Metal and flesh fused. Wires that twitched. Glass that breathed fog. Movement within, but no source. I ordered a retreat. We didn't come for answers. We came for the living. But as we turned, Ramirez collapsed. No sound, no wound. Just gone, eyes open. Pupils dilated, no pulse. Like the others, we moved faster after that. Carried Carr between Beckett and Singh, our NV gear glitching worse with every step. I felt it behind us. No footsteps, just gravity warping. The air pulling at our bones like memory turning physical. Dr. Carr screamed once when we hit the final stairwell. A sound so sharp it cracked something in my ear. Beckett kicked open the last emergency hatch with a rage I've never seen in him before. We emerged into open air like drowning men breaking water. The extraction crew was waiting, blank-faced men in gear that bore no insignia. They took her. Took our gear. Told us nothing. Asked no questions. Just said the phrase that meant everything we saw would never exist. You did your part. Now go. We didn't speak on the ride back. Each man stared straight ahead, sweat still fresh despite the cold. I closed my eyes and saw the pulsing structure again. Not because I wanted to, because it had already etched itself into the folds of my brain. Later, after the report was filed, the mission archived into silence, and our names redacted from the logs, Beckett came to me. Handed me something in a sealed bag. Ramirez's coin, the one he gave me after training. You should keep it, Beckett said. He'd want you to. I nodded, throat tight, fingers closing around it like it meant more than breath. Operation Black Echo changed us. Not because of what we fought, but because of what we touched. A kind of silence that doesn't come from the absence of sound, but from the refusal of the world to acknowledge that something happened at all. But I remembered, and I carried it. Not for glory, not for recognition, but because that mission, that impossible, classified, buried mission, was the reason the SEALs would stand for me later, because they were there. They knew. And when the day came, they didn't need to be told who I was. They remembered, and they rose. The invitation came in a plain manila envelope, hand-delivered without fanfare. Just a name typed cleanly in the center, Latin CMDR Alexandra Rhodes, and a gold seal pressed along the flap like it was trying to whisper rather than shout. I knew what it was before I opened it. I'd heard the rumors, the murmurs in after-action meetings, the way senior officers kept stopping mid-sentence when I passed, as if recalibrating the weight of my presence. After Operation Black Echo, I had become something else. Something no one wanted to define out loud, but everyone recognized when I entered a room. Some called it luck. Others called it instinct. A few muttered words like curse and sacrifice when they thought I wasn't listening. But it wasn't any of those. It was simply this. I had gone into something we weren't meant to survive, and I had come out with every man I led accounted for. Except one. And that silence, that absence, walked beside me everywhere I went. That was the cost. That was the code. The ceremony was to be held at an undisclosed location near Annapolis, deep inside a restricted perimeter usually reserved for advanced war doctrine conferences and legacy war game simulations. They didn't want press. They didn't want cameras. What they were about to award wasn't meant for public consumption. The honor code, capitalized not out of vanity but out of weight, was a tradition older than most of the medals they gave to the dead. It wasn't listed on websites. It didn't come with speeches. It wasn't applied for. It was offered rarely in whispers to those whose conduct in silence had changed something fundamental in the battlefield calculus. You didn't earn it by surviving. You earned it by returning with proof that you hadn't become the very thing you were sent to fight. I sat in the temporary quarters assigned to me the night before the event, staring at the uniform I'd pressed 3 times and still didn't think looked clean enough. The coin Ramirez had given me rested on the desk beside a sealed envelope I hadn't yet opened. It had arrived a week earlier, no return address, but the handwriting was unmistakable. My father's. I had left it untouched. Because I already knew. He wasn't coming. The last time he saw me, I had just returned from Black Echo, and my name had landed on a short list of candidates for the most confidential Joint Command program in the Pacific Theater. He didn't congratulate me. He didn't call. Instead, he published an op-ed in a military journal about how modern standards are eroding the chain of meritocracy and how emotion has no place in tactical leadership. He didn't need to sign it with bitterness. The subtext carried his fingerprint. Everyone knew who it was aimed at. Everyone knew he had a daughter. Everyone saw the photo of me receiving my last commendation and read his essay in the same breath. That was his response. Not silence. Not rejection. But public disavowal dressed in rhetoric. I opened the envelope anyway. Inside one line. Don't confuse visibility with worth. No greeting. No signature, just that. It was his final instruction, perhaps. Or his last attempt at control. I folded the paper back, slid it into the bottom drawer of the desk, and didn't touch it again. The next morning, the sun didn't rise. It revealed itself slowly through fog. As if unsure whether to bless the day or stay hidden in caution, I stood in front of the mirror and clipped the final pin to my collar, hands steady, breath slow. My hair was pulled back, not in regulation tightness, but in the way I liked. Strong, efficient, unapologetic. I didn't look for validation in the reflection. I wasn't dressing for anyone anymore. I was dressing for the version of me that had carried 5 men out of the dark without asking who would believe it. The room was small, barely more than 20 seats arranged in a tight circle around a center pedestal where the citation would be placed. No stage, no microphones, just presence, the kind of solemn space where legacy is acknowledged, not performed. When I entered, heads turned, not abruptly, but with the quiet reverence that precedes serious things. I walked without haste, sat without fidgeting, waited without expecting. The commanding officer, a man whose name I will not write because it does not matter, stood and read the citation aloud. He did not embellish. He did not smile. He simply stated the facts. Operation parameters. Personnel recovered. Tactical decisions. Environmental anomalies. Psychological resilience. Words like irreproducible leadership and containment of unclassifiable threats and zero visibility extraction. Then the final line. For conduct in conditions where traditional doctrine failed, and for returning not only soldiers but their humanity. The Naval Joint Command awards Lieutenant Commander Alexandra Rhodes with the Honor Code, entry sealed, number 24. They pinned nothing on me. They handed me nothing. There was no object. Only a nod. A collective, silent nod from the most decorated, battle-hardened, quietly brutal men I had ever stood among. That was the ritual. You did not receive the Honor Code. You became part of it. Afterward, they allowed 10 minutes for informal acknowledgement. Men who had never looked me in the eye before now stood beside me in silence, some clasping my forearm, others simply nodding once before moving on. No handshakes. No speeches. Just presence. I searched the room once, not for him, not anymore, but for a sign that maybe, somewhere in this space, someone had told him. Maybe someone had said, "Your daughter's being honored in a way few ever will be." But he wasn't there. Not in body, not in breath, not even in shadow. I walked outside after it ended, the air crisp and carrying that distinct scent of salt and pine you only get near the Chesapeake. I stood near the edge of the property, hands tucked behind my back, posture still formal despite the absence of command. That's when Beckett approached, slow, quiet, a flask in his hand and weariness in his bones. He didn't say congratulations. He didn't say much of anything at first, just stood beside me, eyes scanning the horizon like we were waiting for something to emerge from the trees. He would have come, Beckett said finally, if it had been anyone else. I didn't respond. He's afraid of what it means. You being better than he ever was. Still, I said nothing. There was nothing left to say. Not about a man who had built his career on silence and expected the world to mistake that for honor. Beckett handed me the flask. I took a small sip, burned the throat, settled warm. To the ones who carried the fire, he said. I raised the flask slightly. And to the ones who were too afraid to stand close to it. He smiled, a little sad. You'll never need him to see you now. I watched the sky begin to dim, the first edge of dusk cutting the clouds. And I thought about how many years I had spent trying to get him to look at me. Not as a disappointment, not as a deviation, but as something worth naming. That need was gone now. Not because I had replaced it with something else, but because I had stood in a room with men whose names were written in classified operations and whispered in barracks legends, and they had nodded, quiet, complete. And in that moment, I had become untouchable. Not to them, but to the memory of the girl I used to be. The next day, the official record of the ceremony was sealed. My name would not be published. No press release. No file available under FOIA. Only a small, encrypted note in my personnel jacket. Honor code recipient, level black clearance expedited. Immediate eligibility for cross-branch command. My father sent no message, no letter, not even silence, and yet, I no longer needed him to, because from that moment forward, when anyone asked who my father was, I would let them wonder. And when they asked where he had been the day I received the highest recognition our branch could offer, I would answer the only way I knew how. Nowhere near me. It wasn't supposed to happen. I had no intention of speaking, of recounting things I had deliberately kept buried beneath the chain links of silence and discipline. I didn't volunteer for the interview. I didn't reach out to the podcast, didn't contact their producers, didn't write a pitch or agree to a story angle. It came through a backdoor message, routed through someone I had trained beside in Coronado, who now worked with a quiet veteran support initiative. They don't do headlines, he wrote. No politics. No press circuits. Just stories if you want to tell one. No pressure. I sat with the message for 5 days before responding. I don't know why I answered. Maybe I was tired of hearing my story told through fragments, rumors, redacted commendations, and my father's distorted public image. Maybe I was just tired of hearing it told by people who had never carried a bleeding man on their shoulders through a dead radio zone, or watched someone blink at the edge of death and trust you without asking. Or maybe I was just finally ready to tell the truth, not the facts, not the statistics, but the truth that lives under your ribs after the shooting stops. The recording took place in a room smaller than most weapons lockers I've been inside. A desk, 2 microphones, 1 camera tucked just out of sight. The host was a woman named Jordan, former Air Force, soft-spoken but not soft. She had the eyes of someone who had seen too much, and the voice of someone who had learned how to hold pain like a blade, sharp but controlled. She didn't ask for credentials, didn't mention my father, didn't ask about the honor code or Black Echo. She just leaned forward once the mic went live and said, "Tell me who you were," before the silence. It caught me off guard. I wasn't expecting to be asked about who I had been before the missions, before the medals, before the names on the list that no one read out loud. I blinked slowly. Then I spoke. Not from a script, not from memory, just from the place inside me that had never been given room before. I told her about being 6 and asking my father what valor meant. He told me it was something you couldn't speak of, only act on. I told her about the first time I wore a uniform that actually fit me, and how I looked at myself in the mirror and tried to stand the way he did, with his shoulders back like the world owed him its shape. I told her about Annapolis, about training in boots a half size too small because they wouldn't requisition new ones for the only woman in the division, and how no one noticed until my feet bled through the leather. I told her about the sound of someone dying in your arms when you can't stop the bleeding, and the sound you make afterward. Nothing. Just breath. Just the absence of voice. I didn't plan the words. They came in slow waves, not elegant, not dramatic, just honest. I didn't name missions. I didn't name enemies. I just told her what it meant to carry the weight of lives that didn't make it, and the guilt of being the one who did. And somewhere about 40 minutes in, she asked, "What kept you going?" And I answered without thinking, "Some men go to war for honor. Some go for legacy, but I went for the ones who would never have their names engraved on anything. The ones whose silence was so complete I couldn't let mine be." She paused, just looked at me, then leaned forward again and said, "Say that again." And I did. Slower this time. Some men go to war for honor, some for legacy. I went for the ones who never got their names engraved. That was the line that spread, not immediately. Not like a headline. It moved the way quiet things move, slow, deep, deliberate. The episode aired with no promotion. Just a title. She came back with every name but her own. Within a week, veterans were quoting it in group chats. Within 2, it started appearing on forums. A clip went viral on a feed for military spouses, then again in a subreddit for female officers. And then something strange happened. Civilians began to listen, teachers, EMTs. Women who had never served but knew what it meant to carry someone else's burden without recognition. They weren't quoting my rank. They weren't asking about missions. They were repeating one line. I went for the ones who never got their names engraved. It was like I had given language to a grief too quiet to name. The podcast host called me 3 weeks later. "We've never seen this before," she said. "It hit something. I don't think it's just about war." I didn't respond. I didn't want to say the obvious. That it had never been about war. Not really. War was just the environment. The real battle was always silence. And I had finally pierced it. Emails began to pour in. Letters. Packages. Some from soldiers. Some from the mothers of soldiers who hadn't come home. Some from daughters who had never enlisted, but who said they understood anyway. What it meant to stand in a room and be told, without words, that your presence was inconvenient. That your courage made others uncomfortable. That your silence was expected and your pain irrelevant. My command asked if I wanted to do a follow-up. If I wanted to clarify the public narrative, I declined. There was nothing to clarify. I hadn't named anyone. I hadn't exposed secrets. I had only told the truth. And sometimes, that's more disruptive than anything else. Then came the call from the department. Not reprimanding, not praising, just a warning, a courtesy, that the clip had reached people in places who preferred silence. Stay silent. That I had become symbolically visible, that I should consider discretion in future public interactions. I thanked them. Then I ended the call. I wasn't afraid. Not anymore. I had lived through a mission that altered the architecture of my mind. I had walked into a room full of men trained to kill without hesitation and left with their respect without having to raise my voice. There was nothing left to be afraid of. Certainly not the opinion of people who measured power in proximity to command chains they never left to defend. 2 months later, at a routine military ceremony, a young female cadet approached me. She didn't salute. She didn't speak. She just handed me a folded piece of paper, then walked away. Inside, a single sentence. "I'm here because you spoke. I kept that. Paper. More than any medal. More than any coin. Because it reminded me why the silence had to end. Not for me, but for the ones still whispering behind closed doors, wondering if anyone could hear them. It arrived folded in quarters, not an email, not a call, but an envelope hand-delivered by someone who didn't introduce himself, wearing no insignia, no rank. Just a black polo and an expression that didn't flinch when I opened the door still in my boots and sweat from a 13-mile conditioning loop. He didn't wait for acknowledgement, just handed me the envelope with a nod and disappeared back down the stairwell of my building like he'd never been there at all. Inside, a note written in tight formal lines. You are invited to deliver the closing words at the SEAL Strategic Operations Recognition Summit. Attendance confirmed. Subject, your choice. There was no RSVP, no request for confirmation. Just that. Like the assumption had already been made that I would say yes. That someone like me wouldn't decline something like that. As if it were a stage you asked for. As if I had ever asked for a stage. I stared at the letter longer than I should have. Fingers tracing the watermark embossed into the page like it might give me answers. Some kind of code beneath the ink to tell me what they wanted from me this time. It wasn't about content. It wasn't about honor or storytelling or outreach. It was about presence. My presence, and what it meant to place someone like me, female, decorated, visibly invisible until I wasn't, at the end of a program. Historically closed to anyone who hadn't worn the uniform in absolute silence and come home with nothing but a shadow. The summit was not a conference in the traditional sense. It wasn't advertised. It wasn't listed on military calendars. It rotated locations every year, sometimes held in decommissioned training facilities, sometimes on ships so deep in classified zones that the manifest only included code names and blood types. This year, it would be held at a black site known only as Echo Hall, a name passed around in certain circles with a reverence somewhere between fear and worship. It was where the legends gathered, where war was not spoken of in terms of policy but of personal ruin, recovery, and reality. You didn't speak there unless you were asked. You didn't attend unless someone who bled beside you signed off on your name. The fact that my name had landed on their list meant someone, somewhere, had vouched for me in silence. And I had a strong suspicion who I didn't answer right away. I let the invitation sit on the metal table in my quarters for 4 days. I ran my usual routes. I finished my shift. I slept exactly 4 hours and 22 minutes a night, waking up as if some invisible hand was still pressing against my ribs, reminding me that I hadn't earned rest just yet. And every morning I passed the letter, unopened again, unread again, but never ignored. Because I knew what it meant. This wasn't a platform. It was a reckoning. Not of my past, of his. Because the moment I walked into that room, the same room where my father had once stood and delivered a lecture on the disappearance of combat discipline in postmodern warfare, I would no longer be the footnote in his legend. I would become the question mark hanging over everything he'd ever claimed. Still, I said yes. I didn't tell anyone, didn't post, didn't prepare a speech. I just packed the same uniform I wore at Black Echo, the one with the patch still faintly stained from the rain that fell during exfil. I didn't clean it. I didn't replace it. Because I wasn't going there polished. I was going whole. When I arrived at Echo Hall, the air smelled like history that refused to be archived. The ceilings were low, the lights dimmed as if brightness itself had been deemed too loud. The walls were lined with photos that didn't exist on any public record. Men and women mid-mission, mid-battle, mid-blood. Some still alive. Some long since buried beneath flags and folded letters no one read twice. I walked through the corridor without stopping, without reading the names, because I wasn't there to study. I was there to speak. They didn't give me a podium, just a circle. A room of 87, all seated, facing inward. Uniforms varied, some in full dress, others in field gear, like they'd walked in from another war still echoing in their boots. When I stepped into the center, no one applauded. That was the rule. You didn't applaud pain. You received it. I stood without notes. No teleprompter. No assistant waiting in the wings. Just the room and the silence between breaths. I didn't clear my throat. I didn't adjust my collar. I just began. I never wanted to speak, I said. Not because I didn't have anything to say, but because I was taught that silence was safer. That speaking meant exposure. That exposure meant risk. That risk meant questions I couldn't answer because the answers didn't belong to me. They belonged to men who never once saw me as part of the sentence. The air didn't shift. No one moved. That was how you knew they were listening. I was raised by a man who believed that worth came from how closely you aligned with his definition of honor. That the uniform wasn't a symbol, it was a test. And if you didn't wear it the way he did, if you didn't move the way he moved, you were a threat. Not just to him. To the entire institution he believed he embodied. So when I put it on and I wore it differently, not weaker, not louder, just differently, he saw that not as evolution. He saw it as betrayal, a few heads lowered. Not out of shame. Out of recognition. I spent years trying to move like him. I spent years thinking that one more promotion, one more mission, one more casualty survived would be enough to earn a nod, a word, a single sentence of acknowledgement. It never came. Because for men like him, validation is currency, and daughters are not investments. They're mirrors. And when the reflection doesn't match the myth, they shatter it. I paused then, just long enough for them to exhale. I am not here to make a statement. I am not here to reclaim anything, because I never lost it. I am not here to tell you what war is or isn't. You already know. You've tasted it. You've carried it in your blood and your teeth and your silence. I am only here to remind you that sometimes the quietest among us are not the weakest. They are simply the ones who have bled in places where no one was watching. Someone shifted. A breath caught. I carried my men out of a facility that didn't exist, on a mission that no one will ever be allowed to name. I came back with all but one. And in return, I was told to sit still and be grateful. But silence is not gratitude. Silence is grief. And I chose to speak, not for myself, but for the ones who couldn't anymore. Now there was movement. The small kind. Shoulders tightening. Hands clenched against thighs. I was asked to speak today like it was an honor. But I didn't come for the honor. I came for the reckoning. For the moment when a daughter stands where her father once stood, and doesn't ask to be seen, but dares them to look. And then I said the line, the one that wasn't planned, the one that wasn't rehearsed, but the one I had carried like a stone in my throat for years. I am not his legacy. I let it sit there. Then I walked out. No. Applause, no escort, just silence. And behind me, 87 warriors standing up without command, in absolute unison. That was the stage, and it never belonged to him. It never had. I knew from the moment I walked into the hall that he wasn't expecting me. That despite the list of names printed neatly on the official program, despite the sealed folder he had reviewed days earlier, despite the chain of approvals that had passed through his own desk, he had somehow convinced himself I wouldn't show, or that if I did, I'd sit in the back, silent, unremarkable, tucked neatly into a corner of the narrative he'd spent a lifetime authoring, without ever asking who else deserved to write a chapter. The room wasn't large, but it was dense with hierarchy. A carefully curated gathering of top brass, Special Operations Command, international liaisons, and exactly 112 seated operators, every one of them hand-selected, most of them ghosts from the most classified portions of our war history. It was a closed-door event, the kind that never makes it to headlines, held annually to recognize operations that had no name, but shaped outcomes that saved nations. The stage was minimal by design. No flags, no anthems, just a raised platform, a single microphone, and a digital scroll behind the speaker cycling through the names of those being recognized that year. No photos, no service records. Just names, each name followed by silence. A breath, a nod, then the next. It wasn't about theatrics. It was about presence. It was about witnessing. My father stood at the lectern in full uniform, posture immaculate, hands folded in that signature grip that told the room he had already planned every syllable down to the moment he would pause to let his words settle like doctrine. He had done this speech before, many times, and he was always selected for the same reason, because his voice carried the illusion of order. He could speak about loss and legacy without emotion. He could make silence sound like stability. He was the perfect vessel for a system that preferred composure to confession. The room stood still as he began, voice crisp, cadence precise. Every year, we gather to acknowledge the operations we cannot name, the missions we cannot map, the individuals we cannot publicly thank. These warriors operate outside the spotlight, often outside the scope of recognition, and yet they return having shaped the very framework of our national security. Today we speak their names, and we remember them, even if the world cannot. He cleared his throat, opened the folder on the podium, and began reading. One by one, the names rolled through the room like reverent echoes. Lieutenant Marcus H. Denton, Corporal Elise V. Monroe, Commander Thomas J. Rook, Captain Abdul Al-Hanif. Each name received the same honor, a breath held, a nod exchanged, silence maintained, until he reached the page that held mine. I saw it happen. The hesitation. It was only half a second, but in a room like that, every shift registers. He looked down, eyes narrowed ever so slightly, and his fingers moved past the next line in the folder as if the paper itself had betrayed him. He skipped the name, continued. Commander Sienna Grady, Lieutenant Lucas M. Kim. My name was gone, buried, avoided, erased by omission. As if I hadn't spent a lifetime earning my way into that single breath of acknowledgement. As if everything I had bled, built, endured had been a detour in the script he was trying to maintain. I didn't move, didn't stand, didn't blink. But someone else did. Beckett, seated in the third row, shifted forward and cleared his throat. Not loud, not disruptive, just enough to be heard. Ramirez's brother, seated beside the British liaison commander, said clearly, "You missed one." The room paused. My father didn't look up. He simply adjusted the page and said, "All names are accounted for." Then someone stood. It was Singh. I hadn't seen him since the debrief 6 months prior. He had been quiet since Black Echo, had turned down 2 commendations, refused interviews, but now he was standing in full dress uniform, eyes locked on the stage. "Lieutenant Commander Alexandra Rhodes," he said, loud enough for the mic to catch it even though it wasn't meant to. "Operation Black Echo, Unit Echo 2, returned with 0 field losses." My father froze. For a full 5 seconds, the room didn't breathe. Then another voice, from the back, Captain Marlene Duarte, who had flown the exfil chopper the night the ground cracked beneath us and the doors wouldn't open. She carried 4 of them herself. Back broken, arms cut. Didn't stop. Then Chief Beckett, "She's why we're all here." Say her name. Then silence. And then the sound of chairs shifting. The room stood, all of them, not in chaos, in order, in unity, a standing recognition without permission, without protocol, without his lead. One by one, each operator turned toward me. No one spoke. They didn't need to. They had broken formation to form a new one. Not the one written in his notes, but the one written in blood and bone and unspoken memory. My father's face remained unchanged, but I saw it, the twitch at the corner of his jaw, the slight tremor in the paper he gripped too tightly. He didn't say it. Not aloud. He didn't reclaim the skipped name, but he didn't have to, because the room had, because his silence, for once, had no authority. The scroll behind him stopped cycling, then restarted, and this time, when it reached my name, it paused for 5 full seconds. Lieutenant Commander Alexandra Rhodes. No file attached, no image, just a name, and that was all it needed to be. The program resumed. The room sat, the rest of the names were read, and he didn't skip another. Afterward, as the guests dispersed, I walked toward the far exit. Not to make a statement, but because I didn't want to share oxygen with the man who had tried, one last time, to vanish me from the story. As I passed the side corridor, I heard his voice. Low. Tight. You didn't have to let them do that. I stopped, turned, met his eyes, and said, "I didn't. They did it themselves." Then I walked away, because that room had belonged to him for decades, but not anymore. And when he looked up next, he wasn't the one holding the narrative. He was just a man standing alone in a room full of soldiers who no longer followed his orders. Only the truth, and the truth had spoken. It wasn't the kind of ceremony they advertised. No cameras, no live stream, no speeches broadcasted to the masses. This wasn't a PR event, not a morale booster or a check-the-box formality. It was held in a space built underground and off-grid, deep inside the southwestern desert, where the heat cracked the earth and the wind screamed like it remembered things no one else would speak of. The facility was known by many names, most of them unofficial. Some called it the Well, others the Vault. But among the operators who had bled in places without maps, it was just the ground. A place where names were not printed, but spoken. Where truths were not written, but remembered. Where legends didn't come to be celebrated, they came to be laid bare. I wasn't told I'd be attending. I was ordered. But the order came in the form of a suggestion, the way some commands are too sacred to be barked. A black folder slid under my door. My name embossed in matte silver. No seal, no rank. Just 3 words beneath the fold. You've earned this. Inside coordinates. No date, no time. Just present yourself when ready. I didn't ask questions. I packed the same boots I wore during Black Echo, the same dog tags I'd stopped wearing around my neck but still kept in the side pouch of my deployment bag. I didn't prepare a speech. I didn't even think about what I might say if called upon. Because I wasn't going there to be heard. I was going there because for the first time, I had the feeling I wouldn't need to speak at all. When I arrived, the guards didn't check my ID. They opened the gate before I even stepped into view, as if they'd been watching for hours. As if I was the final note in a song that had been playing too long without resolve. The hallway leading to the main hall was unadorned. Bare walls. No medals, no flags. Only silence. The kind of silence that presses against your ears and makes your heartbeat feel intrusive. I walked with measured steps, the echo of each footfall reminding me I was here alone. But not for long. The room opened without warning. No doors. Just space. Massive. Hollowed out of stone and steel. Rows and rows of SEALs seated in perfect formation. Uniforms sharp. Faces still. Over 700 of them, every one of them with the same posture. Back straight, eyes forward, hands resting just above the knees. No one turned as I entered. No one whispered. No one acknowledged me. And yet I felt the weight of their attention. Not as judgment. As recognition, a podium stood at the center, but it was unoccupied. The screen behind it displayed no images, no words, just darkness. I stood at the rear entrance for a moment, unsure if I was supposed to move, to speak, to wait. Then a voice broke the stillness. It wasn't loud. It wasn't amplified. But it carried. She's here. One voice, male, calm, certain. That was the signal. The screen flickered. A single image appeared. It wasn't a portrait. It wasn't a mission debrief. It was a thermal scan from Operation Black Echo. One taken during the final extraction. 5 heat signatures clustered at the base of the fractured structure. One body positioned ahead of the others, bearing the weight of the wounded. Posture defensive. That body was me. No one said my name. They didn't need to. A second later, they stood, all of them, 750 SEALs, in unison, without instruction, without command. They rose to their feet like something sacred had entered the room. Not me, but what I carried. They didn't cheer. They didn't clap. They saluted as one. Right fist to chest, eyes. Forward, not military regulation. Not a textbook gesture. This was something older. Something tribal, something earned. And then one of them spoke. A single phrase that echoed through the chamber like a "Thou, Queen of War." The words weren't shouted. They weren't chanted. They were spoken in reverence, like a title, like a truth. Then a second voice joined, then a third, until the hall was filled with the sound of those 3 words, layered in voices that had survived the worst corners of the world. Queen of War. Queen of War. Queen of War. And I stood there, unable to move because the air had shifted, because the years I had spent being erased, minimized, dismissed, folded into someone else's narrative had dissolved in that moment. Because these were not politicians. These were not administrators. These were not the men who wrote essays about the decline of tactical standards. These were the men who had carried their brothers home in pieces. The men who had held the line when the comms went dead and the evac never came. The men who had seen me bleed, fight, crawl, lead, and survive. They weren't honoring me because I was someone's daughter. They were honoring me because I had walked into a place meant to kill us and walked out with all but one. I didn't bow. I didn't cry. I didn't smile. I simply returned the salute. Slow, deliberate, fist to chest, not as permission, but as acknowledgement. Then the room sat, olive, them, and I was left standing. The lights dimmed. The screen went dark. No further names were read. No more ceremonies followed, because that was the ceremony. That was the moment. That was the closing of something so long left open in me. I didn't even remember what peace could feel like until it pressed into my chest in the shape of 750 fists. And somewhere I knew he had heard, maybe not from that room, but from the echo of, and because the thing he had tried so long to suppress, the possibility that his legacy might not be his, alone had grown larger than him, larger than doctrine, larger than silence. It had become a title, spoken not by blood, but by fire, and fire never lies. When I stepped out of that chamber carved in silence and loyalty, I didn't feel triumphant. I didn't feel vindicated, not yet. What I felt was something deeper, something slower, like the first breath you take after surfacing from being held underwater too long. It didn't burn. It didn't gasp. It simply came like arrowed. My boots hit the hallway floor and echoed differently now, not because the structure had changed, but because I had. For so long, I had walked through military corridors feeling like a guest in a house where my father owned every wall. Even when I earned my own command, even when I signed orders, even when I came home with scars stitched by medics who never asked me twice if I wanted morphine, I still felt like I was walking his shadow. But in that moment, I wasn't walking under anything. I was walking out of something, and the weight had shifted. There was a car waiting for me, unmarked, black interior, government issue, but the driver didn't open the door. He didn't even move when I approached. He stood at attention and gave a sharp, precise nod. Not a salute. Not regulation. Just a gesture. One of respect. One that said, I know what you just walked out of, and I'm not going to insult it with protocol. I got in. We drove in silence. I thought of what would come next. Not medals, I had enough. Not debriefs, I'd given too many. But consequences, the kind that rippled beyond missions. I knew the salute I had received wasn't going to be forgotten. Not by the men in that room. Not by those who heard about it later through whispers, coded emails, redacted logs. And especially not by him, my father, Admiral Reese Callahan. A man who had built a legend out of rigidity, whose spine seemed forged from doctrine, whose love for the Navy was surpassed only by his belief that it was his to mold. And I had cracked that mold. Not through rebellion, not through theatrics, but by surviving everything he said would break me, and being recognized by the very warriors he thought would never stand for me. That salute wasn't his. It never would be. And that silence, the one that followed after, the one that crept into his office, into his legacy, into the hallowed halls where his word used to echo, that silence said everything he could never take back. 3 days later, I received an invitation. A formal one, not from him, from the Navy Secretariat, a roundtable event, joint commendation review. The kind of staged recognition where speeches are crafted, flags are aligned with precise angle calibrations, and every clap is as pre-approved as the guest list. I knew what it was, an attempt to reframe what had already happened, to bring it into the light and control the narrative, to remind everyone that the Navy, at its core, was still a family, and that family didn't fracture. I accepted. When I walked into that hall, this one above ground, flooded with artificial lights, drenched in polished brass and the faint scent of political deodorant, I didn't look for him. I didn't need to. I felt him before I saw him. Still straight-backed, still unmoved, still convinced the only way to command respect was to withhold it. But I also noticed the hesitation, the shift in how others looked at him. The way officers whose chests bore rows of ribbons paused half a breath before greeting him. The way their eyes flicked, not out of deference but out of calculation, as if they were reassessing a truth they'd held for too long. He stood at the far side of the table as the session began. A panel of brass sat behind microphones, stacked in rank and in age. I was announced. My full record was read, but not in a way meant to honor. It was clinical, almost sterile, until the end, when the voice reading it paused. And lastly, recognized with unanimous field commendation by Joint Special Operations Unit Echo 7, designation, Queen of War, a breath, silence, then whispers, suppressed, controlled. But I saw the shift, and I saw his jaw tighten. They called for remarks. I didn't stand. I didn't speak. I simply slid a folder across the polished wood. Inside were handwritten statements, accounts from the SEALs who were there, testimonies. Every single one ended the same way. I stood for her because she never left one of us behind. No embellishments. No medals listed. Just that, the panel nodded. Protocol dictated my father speak next. He stood slowly, his uniform pristine, his insignia gleaming under the synthetic light. He looked at me. For the first time, not as if he were trying to break me, but as if he didn't know what I had become. I raised a daughter to serve the Navy, he began, but I failed to understand the Navy would someday serve her. It wasn't an apology. It wasn't contrition. It was a reckoning. The room held its breath. I held mine. I thought honor came from control, he said, but I was wrong. It comes from sacrifice, and she taught me that. Then, he sat down. The silence that followed wasn't approval. It wasn't celebration. It was the sound of something shifting, something too big for applause, something earned. Later that evening, I found a note in my coat pocket, handwritten, no name signed. But I recognized the penmanship. I salute you now not because you're my daughter, but because you made me remember what a soldier should be. I didn't cry. I didn't fold the paper delicately or hold it to my heart like a scene from a film. I simply put it back in the pocket, because the truth is, I didn't need his words anymore. But maybe he needed to say them. The next morning, I received orders. Not from the upper chain, but from the field. Operational clearance reinstated. Command authorization restored. Not ceremonial. Not honorary. Active duty. Deployment pending. There were still battles to face. But now, they would be mine to lead. And the next time someone asked who I was, I wouldn't have to say my name. They'd already know.